Hi there to everyone. Hope everyone's safe and well, enjoying and getting on with their learning, either in school or at home. We're just continuing to focus on our British Value series of assemblies. We've looked at democracy, we've looked at laws, so let's see what we're going to be moving on to in today's and this week's assembly. So this week we're focusing on individual liberty and freedom, and you can see I've expanded freedom there to talk about a slightly more complex series of words. Individual, meaning down to us and everyone on them by themselves, and liberty, which is another word I can use to describe freedom. So what do I mean by that? Well, in this case we're talking about the freedom to be able to express yourself and do the things that you want to do. And in Britain we have certain values and certain things that perhaps we sometimes take for granted when we consider other areas of the world, and we'll come on to those in a little bit. So these liberties are formed and supported by our rule of law and our democracy. So when we talk about doing the things you want to do, that's something that we want to do which is agreed by our leaders and our people through electing our leaders and the laws they make. So it's not completely what we want to do. So that got me thinking, we're free to elect the rulers we want to represent us and to make decisions in our democracy. We looked at that in our first assembly. And it's those leaders who then ensure that their decisions are fair and equal, and those decisions are then sort of put together through their rule of law and the laws that we have to follow and that help to keep us safe. That's like our second assembly. Which actually means that we're able to actually have these individual liberties and freedoms because these laws make them clear that it's something we're entitled to. So hopefully you can see how all of these areas we're talking around are all linked together, so they do flow into each other to be an important part of what makes us British. So let's have a look at some examples of things that we're free to do, and with each image can you guess what I might be referring to? So here's the first one. Have a look, have a think. So I'm thinking here about how we're actually free to choose the clothes we wear. We're free to choose the styles, we're free to choose the colours that we wear. We can decide whether we want to wear a t-shirt or a jumper or trousers or shorts in hot weather. And within certain laws and certain requirements, because some professions might require a uniform, or in some areas of society for safety, different clothes have to be worn. But generally we have the freedom to be able to choose, and that's not always the case in other areas of our world. Sometimes some governments are much stricter on what people have to wear. What about this one? Well, it's the freedom to be able to learn to drive and then pass a test. Now you have to be a certain age and you would have to satisfy some medical and other background sort of checks, so not everybody can do it, but generally the laws are there to enable people to have that freedom, because once you can drive, a lot of people say it does mean you can go and visit friends, you can go more places, especially in a normal world. But in some other countries that might not be the case. There are some countries, for example, where women aren't allowed to drive. That's an example where in our country the law allows that freedom to both men and women. I bet this one reminds you of the assembly we had in the very first week. So we're free to cast our votes, particularly for who we decide is in charge of our country. Now again, there are laws around ages, and there are laws around exactly who can vote, but generally it's a very important part of our society that people have the freedom to do that and to vote for whoever is on that particular set of choices. There's not just one person to vote for, there's a choice, which again is an important freedom that we have. What about this one? This is an interesting one because it's the freedom that we have to have an opinion, to say what we think and why we think it, and to give reasons for that. And again, that's an interesting one to consider. We have to be careful that we stick to the laws around respect and tolerance and make sure that our speech does not incite hatred or isn't against the law, but generally we can have an opinion on something. In other areas of the world, in other countries and other societies, that may be something which is banned by the government. We'll come back to that one. I can see this one's a house with a private sign. This is the freedom to be able to, if we can, and we're fortunate, to own or to rent private property, so we can have an area which we can raise a family in and which is private to us and which gives us certain rights and freedoms whilst we're inside our own homes. Again, in some places that might not be available. The government may own all the property and decide exactly what happens. Again, this is an interesting one. We can see a group of people meeting. We have the freedom in this country to generally have meetings, to gather together, maybe to share opinions or to meet for work or to meet in a social context. Now remember, at the moment, that's something that we can't easily do because the rules of our society have had to change because of the emergency situation that we're in. What about this one? You can see from this one, it's a good example of where you might select different channels. We're very fortunate that generally we have lots of available channels and we can choose what we want to watch as long as it's appropriate to do so. In some areas, in some countries of the world, in some communities, the choice may be very, very limited, in which case we can't actually choose what we're watching. So remember, when we're talking about freedom and liberty, it doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want. It just means that within what we think is correct and what society believes is right and what the law offers, we're free to do what's right. So let's look at some examples of how that actually might work, and you can decide whether it's wrong or right. So, is this an example of a freedom that we have, or is this something that's not the correct way of using this freedom? It's a boy. He's only 15 and he took this car from his mum without her knowing. Well, there's a couple of things that are wrong with that freedom. He's not reached the right age by law, and also by taking it without mum knowing, he's actually not really respected that that's private property. So that's two freedoms that he's not really used correctly and possibly breaking the law. You can see this as the earlier example with the ballot box where people choose to vote. You can vote if you're older than 18 years old, and that is correct. And that comes back to my point that some of these freedoms do have laws around age or around backgrounds just to make sure they're safe and that they're done properly. Here's the example using the people who were meeting, maybe to share an opinion or to talk about work. But if you look at what they're talking around, it's interesting because they're having a meeting to actually commit a crime, to do something wrong, and that is against the law. They're not using that freedom appropriately. This is the example we had earlier about providing an opinion, something that you feel. This individual is saying that he doesn't like the Prime Minister. Is that right or wrong? He does have the freedom to do this because he's expressed an opinion. He may go on to say why not, as long as he ensures that what he says is respectful and tolerant, and that's something that we can do in Britain. Again, there are other areas of the country and around the world where it's against the law to provide any kind of comment against the people who are in charge. Here's an example using the private property we looked at a bit earlier. We've got the police who've arrived and they're going to break into the house to look around. Is that right, or is that a right or a wrong way of using a freedom? Well, actually it's not correct, because the police can only really come onto private property if they believe a crime is taking place or they've actually got a special reason for doing that, normally provided by a judge to be able to come in, or perhaps the individual of the house has invited them in if they're having a discussion. But they can't just decide to go and do that, so that would be against the law unless they've got a good reason. Here we've got a prisoner and they're explaining they're in prison because they stole something. Is that fair? Is that the fair way of treating someone's freedoms? Yeah, it probably is. If he's broken the law, then one of the consequences of our society is that he may end up in prison, in which case his freedoms may be stopped for some time. Here's another prisoner. They're saying they're in prison because they've said something that the people in charge, the leaders, didn't like. What about that one? Well, that goes back to the conversation that we've just had. He was expressing an opinion and that can't be fair that has been locked up because of it. So that's a freedom that should not be punished. Remember, we do have to do it in a fair and equal way, and we have to think about the words we're using, otherwise it can become illegal and hurtful. So, at the end of my assembly this week, I want to leave you with this week's thought. Should we be free to do whatever we want? So, should we live in a society where we can literally do anything at all, outside of the laws and outside of what people agree to? Or is it important that we do have these freedoms, but they do come with an acceptance that we have to do the right thing? Thanks very much, Aston Hall. Have a great week, and I'll see you next.